Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. You can tell I was a children's librarian, right? So I'm Jill Bourne. I'm the Deputy City Librarian in San Francisco, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the 8th annual One City, One Book in Conversation event. Every year, this event is the highlight for me. It's a personal highlight of the One City, One Book season, which includes a lot of other things that I'm sure you'll hear about. And this year, the library is participating in California Reads, which is a statewide reading and discussion program created by Cal Humanities in partnership with the California Center for the Book and supported by the California State Library. California Reads encourages Californians from all walks of life to participate in reading and discussion programs and activities around the theme of democracy. And what better place to have that discussion than here in San Francisco and here in our wonderful public libraries. This year, San Francisco selected our book, A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster, because of its strong connection to San Francisco and its exploration of the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake. So for the past month, residents from all over the Bay Area, as well as many of you, I'm sure, have been reading and discussing A Paradise Built in Hell. The book explores our need for community and common purpose, which Solnit argues are fundamental to democratic forms of social and political life. In conjunction with discussions about our One City, One Book, we always augment that discussion with other types of programs. And this year, the library has been hosting a series of disaster preparedness presentations with the Red Cross. We've shown a series of democracy-related films. We've hosted talks from San Francisco history experts and displayed images from the 1906 street kitchens up in our, at the Larkin Street Bridge. So I and the library staff want to thank Cal Humanities for their support, but also thank the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library for their ongoing generous support of One City, One Book. And as many of you know, we're in the middle of an amazing week of literary events through Litquake, and we also want to thank our friends at Litquake for co-sponsoring this talk this evening. And then before I conclude our thank yous, I do want to acknowledge our great team at the library who organizes all of our One City, One Book events. Rosie Merlin, and they're always hiding in the sides, so we have to acknowledge them. Rosie Merlin, Michelle Jeffers, and the whole team, thank you so much for your tremendous and always creative work. Now let me tell you a little bit about our speakers this evening. We are so excited to have two very talented women on the stage tonight for a conversation about disaster and democracy. Rebecca Solnit is the author of 13 books about many things: art, landscape, public and collective life, ecology, politics, hope, meandering, reverie, and memory. Her books include Infinite City, San Francisco Atlas, which is a stunning book, if you haven't seen it, of 22 maps and nearly 30 collaborators. Storming the Gates of Paradise, A Field Guide to Getting Lost. Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities. Wanderlust, A History of Walking, and many more. It has been a huge pleasure for us to work with Rebecca this year on the program. I think that we all consider her an honorary librarian at this point. And there is no higher accolade from us, I can tell you. And in conversation with Rebecca this evening is Joanne Hayes-White, who was sworn in as the 25th chief of the San Francisco Fire Department in January 2004. San Francisco is the largest urban fire department in the world with a female chief, which is a point of pride for me and many other women I know. Yes, whoop. And we can thank Chief Hayes-White for that. Prior to her appointment as chief, she served as a director of training for the San Francisco Fire Department, where she oversaw training and continuing education for everyone from new recruits to seasoned veteran firefighters, and also cross-training with paramedics. Chief Hayes-White has been recognized by the San Francisco Business Times as one of the city's most influential women of the year every year since 2004. And again, not that everything is about us at the library, but I can also attest that she and her family are active, very lifelong users of their branch libraries. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Solnit and Chief Joanne Hayes-White to the stage. Thank you.
I thought maybe we could tell them a lot about who we are by where we were on, was it 5:12 p.m. on October 18th, 1989? Did I get that right?
17th.
17th, yes. The 18th was 1906.
Right. April 18th, right? But October was also the Oakland firestorm as well. Maybe you're thinking about that in 1991. So, do you want me to get started?
Yeah, I do.
Certainly. So, first and foremost, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. We're going to be talking, and then at the end, we're going to leave some time for any questions that you may have. Sure. Actually, I usually never have that problem, so thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay, very good. So, again, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a lifelong San Franciscan and have been proudly serving in the fire department for 22 and a half years. In January, I'll have 9 years as the chief of department. So I came into the department of April of 1990, so just after the Loma Prieta earthquake. So what I was doing was coaching volleyball for Urban High School. And we had a volleyball game. I think it started at 5 o'clock. It was at Lick Wilmerding on Ocean Avenue. And I knew that I was hoping to get into the fire department, but I had not yet joined the fire department. And so once all the team players were secure, most of their families were there, I did leave, and I actually went to the local firehouse on Ocean and Phelan, Station 15, volunteered my services, and actually for the next 3 hours or so helped conduct traffic at that really busy intersection. So I think that's very fitting that a few months later then I did enter the fire department. So that's what I was doing on October 17th, 1989.
At 5:12 p.m. I was working on my first book, and everything started to shake, and I'm proud to say my first impulse was to hit save. But it was already too late. I'm a bookish person. I'm a library person. I've been using the public library since I was 18. I have been using interlibrary loan and all kinds of resources at the library like within the last week. I was in my branch library this week, which is Potrero Hill right now. So it's hugely delightful to be working with the library. And, I've been a San Franciscan since 1980 actually, and a Bay Area person since before kindergarten. And the Loma Prieta is really where this project that we're here to talk about in a way starts. Most of us have seen disaster movies and a lot of bad coverage of disasters. And what they mostly tell us is that we're terrified, we're overwhelmed, we're traumatized. And what this isn't necessarily reporting, this is actually ideology. And the assumption is that human beings are kind of frail, but kind of vicious. This means you. Although I like to say my gender is supposed to just run around like headless chickens, getting in people's way and being helpless and confused. That other gender is supposed to be doing a lot of raping and pillaging. Sorry, other gender. And but in fact, that's not really what happens. What struck me with Loma Prieta at the time was the things that sort of the resentment that was brewing on the front burner. I never thought about it again. That really your priorities change. You're very much in the present. The things that are really most important actually matter. The people you love. You're in the here and now in a very intensified way. And then it amazed me for years afterwards whenever people would talk about Loma Prieta. Not everybody. I knew, there were people in my apartment building who were completely freaked out and moved back to Pittsburgh because where they came from, the earth doesn't shake, they told me. It was a classic San Francisco moment. They were like carrying all their stereo equipment down the stairs. And I was like, why are you moving? And they were like, isn't it obvious? And I said, they raised the rent? Because I wasn't actually born here, but I think that does make me a San Franciscan. And but I was like, what is this joy about? Why are people lighting up? And so I was commissioned to do a lecture in 2004, and I'd always been curious about that, and it had been reinforced by a few other things, and I started to start looking into it. And I always say that I feel like I thought I was opening the door on an interesting room, and I found it wasn't a door into a little room, as a door onto this huge, vast landscape that allowed you to look at human nature in a completely different way. Because actually, my gender doesn't do the headless chicken thing. Your gender mostly doesn't do raping and pillaging. In fact, most people are pretty brave, altruistic, resourceful, creative, generous. in both the first moments of disaster. Think of the people helping each other escape from the World Trade Center towers, not trampling, not shoving. I've read hundreds of oral histories. Nobody was shoved. Nobody was trampled. Everybody who needed aid got aid, including a quadriplegic accountant who was carried down 69 flights of steps by his coworkers. So that actually people behave really well overall. There are exceptions, but they're very minor. Most of us behave really well. So in fact, human nature is not as dismal as we've been told, which is really interesting. And that's kind of reassuring. But the joy is something else on top of that. It's about the fact that people often find a deep sense of connection and community and belonging in the work of restoring their community, coming together with their neighbors to figure out how to do things. And I think the joy is about the fact that there's something often missing in our everyday lives, that everyday life can be a kind of disaster of isolation and alienation and meaninglessness, that even something as horrible as a disaster can compensate for. That there's been loss, there's been death, that's terrifying in some ways, but it also brings people together. It brings you into the here and now. It gives you, and for many people, an opportunity to do meaningful work. I was really excited when this book was picked as part of Cal Humanity's Democracy Project, because for me this book was always a book about democracy, because democracy is an incredibly idealistic thing. Democracy says that we can govern ourselves. It's a very radical idea. And to believe that we can govern ourselves is to believe that we're not basically evil, we're not basically chaotic, we're not totally selfish. It's an ideal, and it's an ideology, and officially it's our national ideology because officially this is a democracy. But a lot of people, including a lot of people in power, believe something very different, which is where things began to go wrong in 1906. So did you want to talk a little bit about 1906, Chief?
Sure, happy to talk about 1906. So none of us were here in 1906, but as a tribute to the city, our city, we learned a lot from 1906, and Rebecca's absolutely right. And let me step back a moment, and I think a lot of the points in your book really resonated with me, because as a first responder, but also as a mother of 3 boys, I think it's a good message, and I think it's a realistic message. I think a lot of times people, or the media, which you talk about, focuses on the negative aspects of what happens in a disaster or anything that might be newsworthy, when in reality, I believe there is an innate human quality that people will rise up and want to help each other and become an even stronger community in times of great distress or disaster, and that's exactly what your message is. And it's a hopeful message, because we, in the day-to-day, people do tend to, myself included, you get in your silos and you're working your way and you're doing the best you can for you and your family, but it affords people the ability to work closely together and really try and help. And we've seen it time after time. Now in 1906, what we saw and what we studied is that there was a visionary predecessor of mine. His name was Dennis Sullivan. He was the chief of department at the time. He had talked to the people at City Hall and warned them about our topography here in the city, the hills, the windy conditions, being surrounded by water on 3 sides, the need for redundancy in water supply and in plans and strategy. A lot of what he advised was very good advice, and it fell on deaf ears. And ironically, after the earthquake on April 18th, 1906, he was staying on Bush Street, and it was right adjacent to the old California Hotel. He was in one bedroom. It was early in the morning again, about 5:03, 5:12, and his wife was in the adjacent bedroom. And my understanding is that there was an ornamental piece from the California Hotel that had toppled and literally dropped the wife in her bed down 3 stories to the boiler room. So it was the dark of night. The chief got up, and when he was looking for his wife, he actually fell a great distance down to where her bed was. And she was intact in her bed, but he succumbed to great injuries, steam burns, and back musculoskeletal injuries. So the point is that you had a visionary leader who really was credible. Everyone would have listened to him. He was severely injured, and he died 3 days later. So what happened was this sort of struggle at the top for power of who was in charge. We had military come in. There was a lot of mixed messages. There was dynamiting that was done that actually exacerbated the fires. It was the earthquake, but it was literally the fires that raged for 3 days that damaged our city. And as has been discussed, it only almost swept it from the map. So you had a lot of people willing to assist, but there was really a power struggle, and I think that led to the destruction in 1906.
You know, often when you talk to people about ideas and values and philosophy and stuff, they think it's kind of irrelevant from everyday life. But disaster is really interesting to me because it's so relevant. The Presidio was a very active military base. The military command of the whole western part of the country was based here. And the commander, who might not have been such a bad guy, was out of town. And the second in command is a guy whose name I actually think we should take off, San Francisco Streets and the GGNRA, General Funston. General Funston immediately assumed that people were going to behave incredibly badly and that the military needed to march into the city. It was the largest peacetime occupation of an American city ever. He brought all the troops into the city, essentially saying that the citizens are your enemy, you need to control and contain them, like this was, Baghdad or Saigon and we were at war or something. And that often happens in disaster, that there's a natural disaster. We saw that with Hurricane Katrina, and then there's a social disaster of mismanagement. And Katrina happened very much the same way, with a lack of empathy, a lack of solidarity on the part of people in power, and the assumption that these people were behaving very badly and needed to be controlled and contained rather than aided. So the military marched in, they bayoneted people, they pointed guns at a lot of people, they prevented people from fighting the fires, and often the most successful firefighting was citizens with wet gunny sacks. There was a fire on Russian Hill where, because the water mains were all broken, they used barrels of vinegar to wet their gunny sacks and get on the roofs and sort of smack out the flames. I think you said that's why we don't have wooden shingles here anymore.
Right, that's one of the reasons. And we learned lessons, and also your point is that there were problems. Mostly there was water supply problems, and one of the things that it all came after Chief Sullivan, who again had advocated for redundancy in water supply. In around 1912 or 1913, they finally began constructing an auxiliarized water supply system. So we have an AWSS system that is a high-pressure system, so that it's solely at this point for the use of the fire department. It's an old system, but it's worth its weight in gold, and that it's not in all parts of the city, but it's there as a redundant piece to the domestic water supply. So in the city here, you'll see smaller hydrants, which feeds off of our drinking water, our domestic water supply, but then we also have the higher pressure hydrants, which is non-potable water, but we use for fires as well. So we learned lessons, and then certainly we did in 1989 as well. And I know you speak about the NERT program. We have some NERT-trained folks in the audience. Raise your hand if you've been through the fire department's NERT program. Thank you very much. And you're one as well.
I'm rusty. I need to re-up my training, but I am actually, my NERT card is in my wallet and always is.
Right.
And it was really interesting training I want to talk about a little bit later. So, and then the other thing we should talk about that went wrong, the mayor of San Francisco also made the same assumptions about human nature and put out a shoot-to-kill bulletin for looters. Mm-hmm. It's general, and I always ask people when I do I've talked about this all over the world at this point. I've talked in Italy and Japan as well. Do you believe in the death penalty without benefit of trial for petty theft? Because that's what we shoot looters means, and or shoot to kill, and is private property more important than human life? Is that what you need to sort out in a disaster? And part of the way the authorities sometimes go wrong, and this happened again in Katrina, is to have that priority, confuse those priorities. But so the National Guard came in. The San Francisco police were very much the salt of the earth in those days, belonged to their neighborhoods, and did a really great job. The firefighters lost their leader, but did a good job. The citizens did a good job. But the Army, the National Guard, these cadets who came over from UC Berkeley, et cetera, really made these assumptions that we were out of control and needed to be got under control, and there are terrible stories about things that happened. And then the other thing that happened is the military decided that they were going to blast fire lines, and I bet you know a lot about that.
Yes, and so like I said, that actually exacerbated the fire problem, and again, it indicated that there was a lack of leadership and a power struggle. So when the military came in, they assumed control in a city that they weren't that familiar with and didn't necessarily rely on the subject matter experts that were familiar with suppressing fires. Their priorities were somewhat different than ours. And so I think that added to the problem. And just sort of anecdotally, one of the things, Rebecca and I had the opportunity to meet on Tuesday to sit down for the first time and meet one another. And I was sharing with her that we had a really busy last week. It was Fleet Week. It was the air show. We had 49ers and Giants, just a huge convergence of activities, literally something for everyone in our city. The city should be very proud because it worked out for the most part very well. It was challenging, but I got to participate in a senior leadership seminar with some of our military, and this is year 3 of this dialogue, and how different that dialogue was within the last few years as opposed to in the 1900s, where we now have, not only we celebrate the military and all that they do for us, but that we've built a partnership and we've strengthened that partnership through cross-training. And we've seen time after time, I know in Haiti, the military went in, but they don't go in like they did in 1906. It was so affirming to hear 3 senior military members, one from the Marine Corps, one from the Navy, and one from the Coast Guard, and all of their messages were the same, that we're here in the time of need as a resource, and we're here to support you and fold into your operations. So that whole concept has changed, and I think that in and of itself is pretty revealing about how it's perceived. And I think, to your point about Hurricane Katrina, I think that was definitely a lesson, a takeaway, that the military, they can't just come in and take over because they're not as familiar with local government as the local agencies, but that they be a resource and fold into our strategies and tactics.
Of course, in New Orleans, the mayor was basically AWOL. The police chief was having a nervous breakdown, and they had the most corrupt and incompetent police force in the country that had shot about a dozen African Americans during the aftermath of the storm. And so New Orleans was about a system. My friend, maybe I should back up. I have a wonderful friend, Jaime Cortez, who said to me when we were talking about disaster after the Japanese tsunami, in a disaster you find out what's solid. Anything that was rotten, like the Mexican government in 1985 when they had their huge earthquake, you find out what's rotten. It falls apart in interesting ways, and you find out what's solid. And civil society is often solid. The human nature of most human beings is pretty solid. Your neighbors are probably going to be pretty solid. You're probably going to be pretty solid. But you have these other things that aren't necessarily going to be solid. And some governments do great. I actually think San Francisco's and the Bay Area's local and regional governments responded pretty well, as far as I know, in '89. And I've never heard of anything egregious. And what's also really interesting to me is what was learned from 1989.
Right, and one of the biggest things that was learned in 1989, we took from 1906 and we applied it to 1989, but one of the things that was glaringly missing was the education piece to our community, because San Francisco, it's a great city to live in. I love to travel, but I always love coming back to San Francisco because we do have a very engaged community. Most of us that live here feel like in order to be good citizens, we need to be involved. And you don't get that everywhere you go. Certainly, I think it's more the exception than the rule. And we do lead the way in having a very engaged community. So in 1989, although I was not employed by the San Francisco Fire Department, it was very chaotic. You had hundreds and thousands of people lining up wanting to work shoulder to shoulder with the first responders, fire and police officers. And so shortly after that, the lesson learned was that we have a force multiplier in our community, but what we need to do is assist them and educate them and train them so that it won't be as chaotic as initially it was in 1989. And so that was how the NERT program, the Neighborhood Emergency Response Team Training Program, was born. I was a big fan of it from day one. I became a NERT instructor. And really, without the support and the volunteerism of our community that has time after time supported the NERT program and gone to the retraining sessions, we wouldn't be as well off as we are now. We know that in the event of a disaster, our resources will be quickly overwhelmed. So to be able to have a trained workforce, basically, of approximately 20,000 people we're well off. And people have their roles. They take it very seriously. I mean, as evidenced by the hands in the room, we couldn't do it without you. And I'm so proud of the program. And that's something that has served as a model throughout the country, to be able to have people that have prepared ahead of time. It's too late when the disaster happens and you need to go to work. That's not the time to train people. So the better off, the more prepared we are. And I'm preaching to the choir to most of you, but you all know that the more prepared we are as a community, the quicker we'll be able, and more efficiently we'll be able to respond and then move into that all-important recovery phase. So that was the biggest takeaway from 1989, is to engage the community in ways where we could assist with training and making you feel sufficient neighbor to neighbor, and then assist the first responders.
What I remember from the introduction to the NERT training was that the fire department was really overwhelmed in 1989, and that with the huge marina fires and some of the other emergencies around the city, and that wasn't a big earthquake. That was a 7.1 or a 7.0 or 6.9, depending on how you measure it, based in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so that, but what was really interesting to me is that the city made a philosophical commitment, which is that we trust you. And I'd always thought, until I met with you on Tuesday, that this was really about, the professionals training the rest of us. But there's an interesting way in which the city trained itself to rethink the relationship to civil society, to its citizens, to say, we trust you, we rely on you, we're not even going to pretend we're going to be in control, because there's no way we can be in control. I remember... You've probably done the NERT training a lot. There's a scenario like, if we have something the size of 1906, there will be how many, hundreds of fires? I don't know if they came up with a number, but we don't have nearly the firefighters to respond to that. So it will devolve onto the citizens. But for the city to say, we trust you, we'll collaborate with you, you're necessary, is a really different philosophical position. It's actually living in a democracy where you say the citizens are actually in charge. They should be in charge. They will be in charge. We're not going to prevent them from being in charge. We're just going to help them be in charge.
Right, and I think that there's value added to that, because, as you point out in your book, the San Diego wildfires, there was a lot of questioning on immigration status for people, the looters in New Orleans that you referenced, and certainly some of that goes on, but I think the more that the community is involved and that you show and demonstrate the willingness to have you become our partners, people step up and they rise up, and the perception is that we're in this together, as opposed to this sort of gotcha society where it's about, show me your immigration card, the looting that goes on. So I do think that we are, a sophisticated community. We recognize that we're not going to be able to have control of everything. So the more we engage the community ahead of time and partner with them, knowing that we need them, and makes them feel part of the solution. And I think that serves the city well.
I should just unpack that one of the comments, which is that during the huge San Diego fires a few years ago, they suddenly started checking immigration on status who took refuge from the fires, and something similar happened, I believe, I think it was wildfires in Texas. It was some kind of disaster in Texas. And of course, that creates an incredible danger. If you tell people they'll be penalized for taking refuge, then maybe they won't take refuge. Maybe they'll die. Maybe emergency personnel will be on harm's way trying to rescue people who didn't evacuate because they're afraid. So a lot of my information about what happens in disasters comes from the disaster sociologists who've been studying how human beings react to disasters around the world since the 1950s, and going back to seeing how people responded to the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And and they find this tremendously concerning, because and it's interesting. It's a lack of solidarity, a lack of saying everybody matters, everybody has the right to be safe, and it puts both people who might not have their papers in order and the people who might go out to try and rescue them at risk. And, and it's one of those moments where you have the social fissures, when what you really need is social bonds. And, and it's nice to know that most cities aren't going to make those kinds of priorities about who gets rescued, who gets welcomed to the stadiums or the emergency camps or the evacuation centers. And you told me about approaching people to let out a fire, to let them know that the Red Cross was not going to check your status, that the Red Cross helps everybody regardless, and you didn't need to be afraid. Because one of the, and I'm sure you all know, you're San Franciscans, when you're undocumented, you have to kind of live in the shadows. And it means that you don't feel free to avail yourselves of a lot of services because, you're sort of hiding in plain sight sometimes. And that creates so many sort of stresses and perils and things. But it was great to know, and I hope it becomes very widely known, that things like the Red Cross are, don't care. That's not what they're there for everyone.
Correct. But it is very common. I was referencing a fire in the Mission District a couple of years ago, and we had some people that were displaced, and I could see a reluctance on their part to connect up with Red Cross, and I just sort of figured that it might have to do with residency issues, immigration issues, and so I speak broken Spanish, but I called over. That's what's great about San Francisco, too. We have a workforce that's very diverse. We have a lot of people that speak multiple languages, just like the NERT program being offered in Spanish and Cantonese. It's helpful because we have such a diverse community to have trained, educated people to be able to communicate the message. So I asked one of our Spanish-speaking firefighters to come over and communicate to the family, and there was probably 8 or 10 of them kind of huddled together that, please avail themselves of the services that Red Cross offers, because they don't ask about any of those things. That's not important. The important part is to provide them with food and shelter because they've been displaced and have experienced a disaster of their own. So we try and get that message out as well.
What's going to happen in the next one? Not that you have a crystal ball, but you've probably spent more time on preparation and planning than anybody else in the city at this point.
Yeah, that's a common question, and certainly it is on my mind. I mean, it's not a question of if, but when it's going to happen. And I think we're much better prepared since I came into the department in 1990. Again, lessons learned from 1906, 1989. 9/11, we talked about that a little bit, not a natural disaster, but an act of terrorism. And it opened our eyes in a lot of ways because we've always talked about the natural disaster, but after 9/11, all of our worlds changed, particularly those of us in public service and public safety. At the time, I was the director of training, and our core curriculum was based on disaster response to a natural disaster. We had to enhance our curriculum, unfortunately, but realistically, we needed to get more education alongside our law enforcement partners regarding acts of terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and so forth. So we're better prepared for sort of an all hazards type disaster, whether it's a man-made or natural disaster. We're proud of the NERT program that we've put together. We feel we have redundancies in place. But certainly we will be overwhelmed, and that's why it's important to have the message about preparedness, about partnerships, about the NERT program, 72hours.org, volunteering with the Red Cross, getting some training done that way. I think under Mayor Lee and then Mayor Newsom, they both really, and those are the two mayors that I've worked for, prioritized public safety and see it as a huge priority for people living here in the city and those that visit our city. And so, fortunately, because they've prioritized that, there's been a lot of investments made in training, exercises, equipment, and now in personnel. We're at an all-time low in terms of our staffing in the San Francisco Fire Department, but we're on the upswing because Mayor Lee recognized that we do need to strengthen our workforce and our staffing. And so that's all very positive. Having said that, we can always do more, but all of our departments, I think, in the nearly 9 years I've been its chief, just what I talked about last week, that was very challenging for our city. And with a few exceptions here and there, I know the police department on Saturday had some challenges with some protesters, but in general, it was pretty seamless. And now that's not a disaster, but it's a surge on the system nonetheless. And I think it's a great test of how we work together, how we communicate on a common, command post operations, and it takes a lot of planning. So all of these things, I think, enhance our ability to be better prepared for when we're truly tested with a large-scale disaster.
One of the things that I should mention I have a couple firefighters in my family. I'm a big fan of fire departments. And a smoke jumper, actually, and a Manhattan firefighter. And one very eastern, one very western. Smoke jumpers, are the guys who jump out of helicopters with 100-pound packs into into forest fires. He's a little bit gnarlier than I am, my cousin Alex. But
you can tell him that we're hiring.
He's a nurse now, but who knows? That's what you do when you're a 46-year-old smoke jumper. But I'll tell him anyway. I was going to say, what was remarkable for me about disasters was not that people behaved well, but that they found such joy in the hard work of being part of a community, part of civil society, but the sense of agency, the sense of meaningful work. And I had a sense from my cousins, from what I saw of fire departments in disasters and stuff, that one of the amazing things about being firefighters who have really high job satisfaction is that you kind of live in that state of disaster all the time, in that you're close to death in the way that everything, the uncertainty of everything, that life can suddenly end, and you're doing incredibly meaningful work. You're saving lives. You have great camaraderie with the people you work with and with the people who you save. And so you live in that kind of intensity. And it seems like it's a really special culture in every city, particularly, to have these people who live disaster all the time. And you've been with it for 22 years. How does that resonate with you?
It does. The fire service is a career that is hard to compare to anything else. I mean, you do become like second family to one another. You rely on one another. You literally have each other's backs. And it is very rewarding as well. You do have a tendency to not sweat the small stuff, because on a regular basis you are faced with difficult situations, whether they're medical situations or fires. You're faced with situations where you put your priorities in place, and it kind of pretty much every day you realize how lucky you are, and that it is very much job satisfaction, because our goal is to help save lives and property, and we don't always get our end goal, but we try as hard as we can. And so it does force you to be very appreciative, I think, and you don't take things as much for granted, because you see a lot of suffering, and hopefully most of the time we're able to go out and make a difference. So it is, I still love coming to work every day. I miss being out in the firehouse every day, so I try and get out as much as I can. Certainly last year, for those of you that live in the city, was probably the toughest, and it remains with me every day, is when we lost 2 firefighters. And that was something, my goal was, when I had this job, I wanted to make sure everyone was able to go home. And it didn't work out for 2 of our members, Vince and Tony, last year, when they were fighting a fire at a really not a huge fire. I mean, it was a residential fire up in Diamond Heights. We have much riskier responses to, say, the BART tunnel or Muni tunnel, high rises. So it does put into perspective the dangers that are out there as well. So, but it is, it's a very rewarding occupation.
Should we start taking questions from the
Sure.
audience? I bet they have a lot.
I always say, do you have any burning questions for the fire chief?
And there are microphones that will go around. This is being recorded, so please wait for the mic. Which is where is that microphone?
There's 2.
There's 2. Okay. So, and I see lots of arms.
I love the message that most people, when stressed, will act well rather than badly. I'm wondering whether this has already been communicated to people in San Francisco or elsewhere who are going to be at the top making decisions if and when something horrid strikes. Does the mayor know this? Does your counterpart at the head of the police know this? Has this message been gotten to people who really, really need to know it already, or is that work yet to be done?
Well, I can tell you, Mayor Lee is a huge supporter of the concept of the NERT program, getting the community involved, the preparedness message. And a true story is, before he was mayor, I guess he was city administrator just before that. I think it was when he was city administrator, or else the head of Department of Public Works. And he gets it. I ran into him on a weekend way before this whole mayor thing came up for him. And he was at Big Five. He was getting a transistor radio. He was getting his kit together. And so he gets it. And he very much respects the fact that we do need to engage our community, and we do need that trust to exist that Rebecca discussed. As well, I consider Greg Sir, as well as his predecessors. I've worked with George Gascon and Heather Fong since I've been chief, and all of us work very closely together, recognizing that we're going to need to rely on our community, and that it is a bit of a different role as in law enforcement, but that I believe I really believe, as does the mayor, and I believe Chief Sir would as well, is that there is an innate human quality that most people under adverse conditions will step up and not be someone that you're going to need to restrain. So I think that the message is fairly clear here in the city. Thank you.
One of the problems, though, is that I wrote, as a writer, all you do is you write and hope that the word gets out. I had actually done an essay on disaster. I did these talks in 2004, 2005, and then I did an essay on disaster for Harper's that went to press on August 29th, 2005. And Katrina happened that day. I called them up and said, I think I'd like to make some changes in the piece. But it was too late, and I hesitated for a while. And then things went so profoundly wrong in Katrina, so unnecessarily, that I felt, okay, I have to write this book. But how you reach all those government officials is something. But the chief and I were talking, because even more than that, how do you get the media to stop telling the wrong story? And so much of what went wrong in Katrina is that the media started spreading rumors. The media abandoned, and I'm trained as a journalist. You have really strict standards for reliable sources, verifiable data. But suddenly they were spreading rumors about mass murder and rape in the convention center and the Superdome. The FEMA actually sent a tractor, 18-wheeler refrigerator truck for the 200 bodies they expected. In fact, there were six people, 6 corpses, four natural deaths, because being without your meds in incredibly hot, stressful conditions is hard on a lot of the frail people left behind. A suicide, and I think the result of an accident or altercation. So nobody shot at helicopters, but most of the mainstream media repeated that, so there were no helicopters. They called off the helicopters. And the media failed profoundly, and that really shaped, and the officials believed them. And so it was this kind of feedback loop spreading a bunch of news that never happened, including the Huffington Post claimed reports of cannibalism, which they quickly stripped from their website. And this willingness to believe the worst of your own people began that. I've never quite unpacked it. See, did the mayor and the police chief actually get their stuff from CNN and NBC and the New York Times and stuff? But I always feel that the media were kind of unindicted co-conspirators in the disaster. So we've actually talked about how do you brief the media to not abandon their standards, do a good job, don't fall back on cliches, and also with stuff like looting. I know the map brochure that you can get for free out front that the librarian and I put together. I quote this wonderful rabbi, I think his name was Vogelsang, who said he was the biggest thief in the United States in 1906. And why was a rabbi the biggest thief in the United States? Because money no longer existed. And, in 1906, the banks were just shut. If you opened the bank vaults were red hot. If you opened them, the money would, the paper money would literally, go up in flames. And if we had an earthquake tomorrow, your bank card and your ATM cards and things, there won't be electricity. You won't be able to banks won't be open. You might have some cash on hand, but there probably won't be storekeepers. If somebody badly needs medicine, if you need diapers for your grandson or your kid, or, you might be getting that stuff from Walgreens without benefit of shopping. Is that, is that a crime? I think that's kind of academic. Is it preventing human suffering or saving lives? That's why the rabbi was the biggest thief in the United States. And so, so the media also needs to learn how to interpret these things. And then I think police departments and whoever else is there need to say, okay, protecting Walgreens is not our highest. Literally in New Orleans, people were called off search and rescue as grandmothers were dying in overheated attics to protect, chain stores. And that is just like and so cities need to be prepared. I'm pretty confident about the Bay Area, but I'm not sure what will happen in other places. And so I say it's really important to pack your disaster kit. I have 2 hand-cranked radios and lots of camping gear and the rest of it. And but I also think that you need to unpack stuff. You need to unpack cliches and rumors and stereotypes. And you need to also, that there's some ways in which you need to be autonomous, which is a 72-hour concept, but there's some ways in which you aren't autonomous. You need to pack your government well, in a sense. You need to pack them with the right information, and you need to make sure that there is good disaster preparedness plans, and they're not going to fall apart the way that the mayor of San Francisco did in 2006 or the mayor of New Orleans in 2005.
And just a comment on the media to your question is one of the things that we're doing in the city, because I think a lot of times the media goes astray if they don't get information, and they get frustrated, and so they kind of focus in on something that maybe is, again, more the exception than the rule. So when we practice and we train and have drills, we incorporate actual media into our joint information center, because I think the more information that gets communicated out to the public through the media, I think it's important, and that local government can drive how the media in some cases is reporting, and that it's responsible reporting, but it's our responsibility to provide them with the information, accurate information, because they'll be there if you allow them to. And I think that a lot of times, and again, it's that trust factor. It's kind of a new concept, but to bring them in is not a bad thing, in my opinion, because you're giving them, you're somehow driving the message, and you're giving them up-to-date information, as opposed to them trying to chase a story because we're not giving them regular information. And then we need to use them as our partners so that we can convey what exactly is happening to the community, where they, should they be sheltering in place? Should they be making plans to evacuate, that kind of thing. So I think it's important for the local government to also engage the media and give them up-to-date information.
I should just say one more thing. Some media people did amazingly in Katrina, and the newspapers were mostly pretty good in 2006 San Francisco. There was a radio reporter who was like the only guy broadcasting during the worst of the storm and the aftermath in Katrina, who became the place where people went for reliable information. He was kind of this hero broadcasting out of, a wrecked station. And he was also conveying personal messages like you might hear on a small town radio, like such and such needs to get in touch with so and so, and your grandparents were evacuated to Baton Rouge or stuff like that. And there were a lot of people on the ground, media people, some of whom became rescuers, some of whom did a good job. It was often the further away you were from the actual disaster, the more you were likely to go crazy and believe strange things. And I think that, so the media isn't all bad, but they need to pack their own earthquake kits of how to prepare for a disaster, what to expect, how not to make the mistakes that have been mistaken before.
More questions?
Yeah, I think it's on. I was really excited and interested to read about the connections between disasters and political change. I thought that was very apropos. And I'm just on the chapter about 9/11, so I haven't finished the book. But I'm wondering if, this is more to Rebecca, whether you think that there's any connection, despite the time lag, between 9/11 and Occupy Wall Street.
When I went to Zuccotti Park, where Occupy Wall Street started and flourished for those months before it was dismantled, I was shocked how close it was to Ground Zero. It was about 3 blocks from Wall Street. It was half a block from Ground Zero. And apparently a lot of the construction workers building the new tower were coming over and hanging out and talking with people, friends of mine who'd been part of Occupy said. And it felt to me, I feel like the real story of 9/11 didn't get told much. And it was another thing where the media got it wrong. The firefighters and the police behaved honorably, but people mostly rescued themselves. And the firefighters were, they had bad communications equipment. A lot of, all those guys who died, it could have been really different. But the media got really obsessed with men in uniform, and the men in uniform were fine, but actually they weren't the whole story. How many of you know that 500,000 people were evacuated from Lower Manhattan that day, mostly by noon, by a spontaneously assembled armada of everything from tugboats to historic tall ships to... Yeah, okay, but how many people know about that independently? Yeah, well, not very many of you. You know that all kinds of people rose to the occasion. It wasn't just men, it wasn't just people in uniform. And in fact, civil society was incredibly powerful, and I find it incredibly compelling that the Pentagon was unable to respond that day and to prevent anything from happening, but the unarmed passengers of the plane that crashed were able to organize, complete strangers, the most unexpected and strange and terrifying thing that could possibly happen. And very quickly, they have they're a team, they have a plan, and they carry it out, and they may have saved the White House or, I forget, wherever that plane was headed. So, civil society was actually tremendously powerful that day, and there was a tremendous sense of solidarity. That wasn't the story the Bush administration and the media wanted to tell. And, the story that we were told is that we need to rely on the authorities. We were told, the word terror was used all the time, even though the people in the towers were not terrorized. They were definitely, frightened in some way, but not in a sense of shocked, paralyzed, ineffectual, whatever. People, they might have been shaking, but they were still evacuating, and they were behaving very, very sanely. The media also often misinterprets this, and when a cloud of... When death is coming towards you, running is often the calmest, wisest thing to do. It might look like panic on the cameras, but it's pretty smart, and it's not hysterical. So in a funny way, it felt like a return to that sense of great solidarity and strong civil society for me, because I'd spent so much time dealing with 9/11, and I got quite involved with Occupy in the Bay Area and in New York. So, but what I think Occupy really was a response to is that an economic disaster is also a disaster. It's also where the system cracks, where there are fissures. Most economic disasters, there's a sense of breach of trust, that the bankers or the government has somehow mismanaged things. And the Argentinian economic disaster, which happened only a few months after 9/11, created a kind of social uprising. There was a rebirth of civil society in a very powerful and very beautiful way that really brought Argentina back. And Argentinians had been very withdrawn for many decades because of the death squads and the military juntas and things like that. They'd just been so shut down because you never knew who was spying on you. You never knew what you might end up getting tortured for. You weren't going to venture opinions. You weren't going to talk that much to strangers. So everybody had just kind of shut down, and they were just so outraged by the destruction of the economy, and all the banks got basically, everybody's assets got frozen. Suddenly it didn't matter if you had money in the bank, you couldn't access it, there was no money. And people went out and did this amazing stuff, and several governments fell in quick succession. A lot of new political forms were invented. In fact, the term horizontalism, which means a non-hierarchical kind of direct democracy, comes out of that moment in Argentina and became a big moment in Occupy. I think we kind of had a delayed response to the economic collapse in 2008, and this is very much my reading. But those of you who already know me know I have a lot of opinions, and a lot of them are strong. And I think for a lot of people, electing Obama was an attempt to make things different. And there was a sense that, okay, we didn't reform Wall Street, we didn't clean up the mess, and for a lot of people facing foreclosure, student debt, medical debt, things got worse. And Occupy came out of that, and out of the way that our society is being squeezed in both directions. So you're getting the super rich and people, in a kind of shrinking middle class, and more people really, really struggling. So it comes out of also that great fissure opening up in our society. But what amazed me, and I saw a lot of Occupies around the country, I saw New Orleans, I saw Tucson, and some of the smaller ones, etc., is that it looked like there had been an earthquake. Suddenly everybody's living in tents. Where do I know people living in tents from? I know it from earthquakes. So you look at all these people, and they're running community kitchens, and there's something very deeply moving about the way that the homeless were welcomed into many of them. The kitchens were for everybody. Medics came and set up clinics, and people who had no access to medical care were actually getting access to medical care and things like Occupy Oakland. And, and so it really felt like a disaster had happened. It looked like a physical disaster had happened, and there wasn't a physical disaster. Although, if you've just lost your home to a foreclosure, maybe there has been a physical disaster. So those were kind of the connections I saw with Occupy, and I'm glad you brought it up, so thank you. But I know there's a million more questions here.
So I was going to ask you, I'm glad you brought up United 93. My question has to do with kind of the opposite of what happened in United 93, where there was like this heroic civilian push to, save what would have been the disaster from the if the plane had landed. And my question has to do with, so in these kind of broader disasters, we see this mostly altruism. What I've personally experienced in seeing personal disasters and how people react to that is very different. And I'm interested in what you think about things like the psychological phenomenon of the bystander effect, which is what happened with the young girl who was raped in Richmond a couple of years ago. And my personal experience was there was a mugging on a bus, and I was literally the only person not knowing how to stop it, but the only person even trying, and everybody on the back of the bus just moved to the front of the bus. And so I feel like there's some way that people can be empowered in these kind of like personal disaster situations, but I haven't really seen that translation, even though I totally believe that, in these big disasters, this altruism does happen. There is also the kind of this seedier side of sometimes human behavior that is sometimes reported in the news, and I know I've personally experienced that where people aren't kind of stepping up to the plate or taking personal individual responsibility or trying to do something about the situation. Just interested in your thoughts on those two things kind of juxtaposed.
These huge collective disasters are very different than individual disaster. My friend Philip Fradkin, who died this summer, wrote a really good book on the 1906 earthquake, but his own house had burnt down in West Marin, and it had been very traumatic for him and his wife. And William James, the philosopher, was at Stanford during the 1906 earthquake. He immediately took the train to San Francisco and was really fascinated by what he saw. And he was really the first disaster scholar that I know of. And he wrote that, it's the loneliness of our disasters. If your house burns down, you're all alone. Everybody else is housed. Your situation, you no longer fit in a sense, and your suffering is lonely because you're the only person, or your family's the only family. But if the whole city burns down, suddenly everybody's in this boat with you. So that's partly different. And then also when you have a big disaster, it affects all kinds of people. And, I'm not sure. And the Richmond rape was a crime, not a disaster. But I do think that, and it's funny because I think young men, though I know some incredibly wonderful ones, but they're more susceptible to some really toxic socialization than just about anybody. One of the things I thought about talking about in this book, but didn't, some of you may know about the famous Stanford experiment with, what's the name of the, Philip Zimbardo, who got a group, created a fake prison situation with undergraduates in the late 60s or early 70s, where they're all male, they're all Stanford students, and he got them to play the roles of prison guards and prisoners, and the prison guards became really sadistic and got into their roles so much that they started to deeply traumatize the prisoners. And both Zimbardo's fiance and the mothers of one of the students said, "What the hell are you doing? This has to stop." And so he was supposed to go for a week. He stopped it after three or 4 days or something like that. And then they drew all these conclusions about human nature. I always feel like that's not human nature. That's young men. That, I don't think you could get a group of middle-aged church ladies to perform Zimbardo's prison experiment, or even a group of middle-aged men. They'd be like, I'm not going to go along with this. This is not who I am. I've got a life. I've got an identity. I don't care if this makes me uncool or stuff like that. So I think that there's pieces like that. And that one of the things with disaster is that it really mixes everyone up. Grandmothers are there and children are there and everybody from every walk of life and phase of life in between.
Right.
So,
And I think sort of maybe a safety in numbers, although that is a little discouraging because I'm raising 3 boys, but I know what you're saying.
well,
I know what you're saying.
yeah.
19, 15, and 13, but the classic is, which I've talked about to my sons, is the what happened at Penn State. And somehow thinking that standing by is an okay thing to do. So I kind of agree that in a larger scale disaster, whether like the safety in numbers or, don't let it just be me, because I have, as a first responder, witnessed exactly what you've described. And time after time, it's like, why didn't somebody step in, step up? Sometimes people have a real personal safety issue if there's a crime being committed. But even in the instance of performing CPR, some people are concerned about, the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and disease and so forth. But now what we're trying to push is a hands-only CPR. So literally putting compressions, pounding on someone's chest, there's a greater level of survivability if someone is willing to do that. But it's getting them in sort of these personal emergencies or personal sort of mini disasters to step up. And I agree with you. I don't see that happening nearly as much as I do when there's a larger scale emergency in the city. And it's an interesting thing to study.
And there are times when people intervene. I've been the victim of attempted crimes and people, when somebody stepped up. And it's not to malign all young men. I think they're just...
Thank you.
Some of my favorite people, et cetera. But I think that they are malleable in groups of a certain size, and that so many things encourage them, video games and et cetera, to be awful, that it's amazing how wonderful most of them are. That these notions of masculinity and violence and stuff are really a big part of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
So, oh my God, so many questions.
You both spoke about some of the mishaps of the 1908 or 1906 fire by authorities, and I was curious, Chief Hayes-White, if you were put in those shoes, what are some of the things that you would have done differently?
Survive.
Survive
as a fire chief.
Exactly, and I think the loss of the leader of the fire department really sort of crippled the city for those few days. Exactly. So I think one of the things that you need to do rather quickly, and that's why you need to have a plan, is that you need to look at sort of a risk management perspective and doing the greatest good for the most amount of people. So if there are different challenges, fires that you need to suppress, you need to look at occupancy and the load of, how many lives you can save and where you apply your resources, and then where you need to prioritize and then maybe have a queue, because unfortunately in those types of disasters there will be a queue of calls waiting. So it's the ability to, through good planning, through a knowledge of what, where the fires are burning, who's involved. If it's a school, obviously, or a hospital, you have a high occupancy load. So you need to apply resources and prioritize that, a high-rise building, an office building. Those are the types of things that we look at in terms of how we prioritize. Obviously, on a given day, we're doing the best we can, and we pride ourselves on getting to any emergency within 3 to 5 minutes. And it works most of the time. But that all goes out the window in a large-scale emergency. So the ability to prioritize and apply your resources, knowing that we have robust recall procedures as well. California has a very robust master mutual aid plan that was born probably over 55 years ago, and it's a model for the nation. So we've very rarely brought resources in, but we have the ability and capacity to do so. And so thinking ahead and planning ahead.
One thing that's really interesting to me is that on smaller disasters, you have a top-down, if we have a really big fire, you might be making some of the major decisions. But if we have 100 fires, you're just going to have to trust that the system you've been working to improve and maintain for all these years is going to work, because you can't deal with, you personally can't make decisions about or go to 100 fires. Right. So in a funny way, and it's something the disaster sociologists talk about, that these sort of command and control structures aren't always relevant in a disaster, because there isn't time to funnel the information up the line and for decisions to come down, and there's just too many decisions to be made and too many many
Right.
things going on.
And we would say that you're absolutely right. It's a top down when it's a more localized, but if it's larger scale, we still like to say that we have a structure, but it's more decentralized as opposed to being centralized, and that each event or incident has somebody that's a person in charge, and then people that funnel in from the department as well as other city departments, and then our NERT responders. And so I'm just looking at 7:10. I have about 10 more minutes. I think
Okay.
we're supposed to break at 7:15. I have
Yeah,
one more stop
okay.
to make. So I'd love to try and take all the questions, but sort of give the rapid fire answers.
Okay.
Hello?
Okay.
Hello?
Because I hate leaving the room with any questions.
Maybe let's take 3 questions and then try and then answer them, and then see if we can take another 3.
Okay, sure.
Would that work?
Can I speak to the chief here for a second? I'm a broadcast engineer, and I've worked with emergency systems for radio and television. But one of the issues that comes up in disaster relief is that the two-way communication systems are overwhelmed, or different jurisdictions in mutual aid cannot speak to each other. And now, with the FCC changing broadcast systems, the new frequencies that are available after the conversion to digital television, these channels are now available. My question is San Francisco compatible now with different jurisdictions and different communities in terms of radio communications for a disaster?
Yes, it's a great question, and there have been communication challenges, and with the sort of the opening up of the broadband, we do have the capacity now to communicate much better than we ever did before, and it's only getting better, and it's working through our Department of Emergency Management. We've applied for grants so that we can communicate with other jurisdictions coming in. Certainly throughout the city, all of us have a common frequency that we can communicate on, but you're right, when there's a disaster, to have people come in, whether it's with their own equipment or equipment that we issue them, we need to have that common operating communication system. So we do. Next question.
Hi, I wanted to piggyback on the question about Occupy. One of the things we were challenged by in the encampments was that people came that had mental challenges, and as the 99%, we weren't always trained to respond to that. In a catastrophic disaster like we've been talking about tonight, do you have some suggestions on how the general public can be better prepared to assist our fellow citizens that have mental illnesses and may not be as able to respond on their own?
So that directed toward me. I mean, I have some ideas. I know that, and I was going to try and stay out of the Occupy a little bit more, because we did, frankly, have a lot of challenges with the Occupy down at, and I'm just being very candid, that's just who I am. And I get the kitchens and so forth, but we also had people illegally starting fires that they were not permitted for, and so forth. So it was challenging because, again, we're when we talk about disasters, people coming together. My experience with Occupy, and I think the police department here in San Francisco, certainly better than Oakland, did a very good job. They wanted people to express their feelings and their right to free speech and so forth. But where the line was drawn was when we did have people not treating each other very well in the camps. We had people being disrespectful to one another. We responded in not a lot, but a fair enough times that we were concerned about the public safety, because you had different factions of people coming together. There was a lot of mental health issues that rose to the top. We had some Department of Public Health experts come out and try and deal with that. So if you're asking about the Occupy, so I'm not sure if I totally got your question about.
If it was a major disaster,
Yes.
like an earthquake, we had challenges even in the Occupy model where there was no physical disaster around it. If it was a physical disaster, do you have some suggestions on how we might assist those when we did not necessarily do well on that end of it in the Occupy model?
Right. So I would say, when we train people to be NERT volunteers, I do think people that have mental health challenges need special assistance, and they need people that have expertise in that. And so certainly, since the fire department oversees the NERT program, that wouldn't be a population that we would have a NERT volunteer step up at, because they're not trained in that. And I have some training in it, but through the Department of Public Health, there's resources with which we would try to, as much as possible, given a disaster and all of the other challenges, try and channel as much as we could them to subject matter experts, people that have dealt with mental health challenges. But that certainly is a concern that I think we're continuing to work on. But we would not have a NERT volunteer overseeing a population that has mental health challenges, particularly in a disaster, because that could exacerbate their mental health issues as well.
I would also say that Occupy ended up with a really high percentage of people who had substance problems and mental health problems. If suddenly we had a disaster and 50% of San Francisco became homeless because of it, the percentage of people who had mental, had sort of emotional and mental difficulties would be much smaller than it was. Because the Occupy camps, suddenly you had community, you had free food, you had medical care, et cetera. It became real magnets for people who, and the Occupy movement got blamed for it, but these were people whose needs were not being met, who suddenly found a place where sometimes their needs were met really beautifully, but it also overwhelmed a lot of the Occupies, because I often would look at these things and think, okay, you can deal with 5% or 10% of really needy people, and a whole lot of really high-functioning people to try and meet their needs. But when it gets to be 20 or 30 or something like percent, then it's really overwhelming. Although I just want to throw out that crime went down in Oakland when Occupy was at its height in Oakland. No, seriously, it's leaked. It was leaked in an email from, I believe, the police chief to the mayor, saying, crime's down 31%. We don't really want to make that public. Because it was, that was not their message. And so I think that it was that these things, and I recognize the sanitary issues and the health hazards and some of the other stuff. Occupy San Francisco was really messy in a lot of different ways. But there was also something really beautiful happening, and it worked. It worked in very different ways in different communities. Occupy San Francisco was super well behaved and lasted a very long time, cooperating with city officials. Occupy Wall Street in Manhattan had its own identity. Occupy Bernal Heights is still working on foreclosure defenses in San Francisco and doing beautiful things. So, and I suspect you need to run.
Yes, I'm so sorry to cut off the question.
Before you cut off, I would just like to say, so you were going to come up here anyways. It's not like I'm ruining everyone's evening. But I would just like to say it was a real treat and delight to meet Rebecca. We met on Tuesday, and I think, the broad spectrum of what you've written about is very interesting. And she was kind enough to give me this book, Infinite City, which I've just had the ability to kind of thumb through, but she calls it a San Francisco Atlas, which is, it's particularly being born and raised here. It looks like it's going to be a great read. So I would encourage you to take a look at this. And it's not a paid endorsement or anything. It's just, it was very kind of you to do that. And also, it's been a pleasure. Now, I feel bad if someone did have a question about city government, fire department, anything that they wanted to know that they didn't get answered from me tonight. Please feel free I have a phone number I can give you and an email as well, because that's what I get paid to do, answer questions and be out in the community. I have one more event that I need to be at, but my office number is 415-558-3401. We do have a website, but I'll give you my email at work. It's Joanne, Joanne, .hayes, Hayes -white, like the color, at sfgov.org. And it's just been a pleasure being here tonight.
Thank you, Chief. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, Rebecca. And thanks to all of you for coming out on this cold night. Thank you so much. Have a good night.